Well, so I think this is, you mentioned the sort of how we approach national foreign policy with this mirror imaging. And I think this has really set the US back a lot with dealing with the Second Cold War, because I think a lot of people in the United States, and particularly in some branches of the government, don't even see the fact that we're in another Cold War with China, because there's this idea that, after the first Cold War ended, that was the end of history. Why would we ever want to do that again? It's not rational. We have this worldview of globalism now where we can all just trade and we won't have to do this ever again. And that's kind of left the country. We don't have a whole of society approach to dealing with communist China.
Well, and that's by design. Globalization, the internet gave them reach into our societies, and they use that to insinuate themselves everywhere. And I think that's like just the other day there was, I was looking at this article talking about how, um, judges, and it was I think an MIT economist was testifying to Congress about how judges are, favoring the arguments of corporations when they say, "Hey, this merger that we're going to have is not going to, lead to monopolistic behavior. It's not going to hurt consumers. It's not going to hurt competition." And when you start to kind of look at the judiciary, the legislative branch, executive branch, and start to understand that you have the back and forth of people working in these very large corporations, and then they find themselves in government, and maybe they find themselves then becoming a judge, or find themselves working in the Commerce or Treasury Department, or they also have enormous lobbying functions on Capitol Hill. Then you begin to understand that these same corporations are paying the think tanks, and they're paying the lobbying firms, and they're paying the communications firms in Washington, D.C., and in New York as well. You start to begin to understand that the way they insinuated themselves is very much aligned with corporate power in the rise of corporate power and the consolidation of corporate power in the United States. And so that's how you get into this ability to influence our political system without having to really overtly do it. You basically, they are essentially aligned business interests with the same donors that, for example, donate to the think tanks in Washington, D.C. And so when you look at, and having spent my career in government, and you look at, okay, what is it that government thinks about China, and why do they think it? Well, a lot of the expertise and advice comes from academia and think tanks in Washington, D.C. A lot of the experts, the China experts, they're in these think tanks. Well, when you start to understand that the corporate donors to these think tanks are aligned with the Chinese Communist Party in terms of their business interests, then you start to realize you get to this area where it's very hard for you to get out of this narrative that is promoting this idea of highly centralized power in government. And so what I'm saying is you're starting to see, and this is where I think that we have to really begin to think about this second Cold War. You're starting to see the type of political system arise in the West that in many cases and in many ways mirrors what the Chinese Communist Party. It's a very centralized system. Antitrust is almost non-existent now. Patent protections, which were in the Constitution, have been watered down through legislation promoted by these large corporate interests. And the unhealthy part of that is that it has led to the suppression of speech. There is a narrative, there is an acceptable narrative, and then there's all the other voices that are kind of countered that narrative. And so when you're an official in the Defense Department or the State Department, you pretty much have an idea of what is the proper way to think about China, and it is not to think about them as ruthless killers. It's to look at them as, rational actors in the same way. So, Xi Jinping is a rational actor in the same way that Joe Biden's a rational actor. And that the insanity of that is not able to be discussed in forums, whether they're in government or outside government, because that's outside the character of the narratives that are allowed. This is what I experienced myself when we were working on, beginning to try to make senior leaders in the Defense Department understand the competition with China. You had to tread lightly, and you had to watch what you said. That was during the Obama administration. So even now, after all of these years, you're still seeing in Washington D.C. these elements come out and say, if you say the Chinese Communist Party is bad or evil, like say you say they're evil, they may say that you're a right-wing fascist or something of that nature. You're saying something just forbidden to be said. And so if you realize that that idea that you're a right-wing fascist because you think the Chinese Communist Party is evil really lets you know that it's very hard for Washington D.C. to begin to understand the threat from the Chinese Communist Party because they're not allowed to really speak about it.
Now, and if you go back 50 years and a government official called the Soviet Union evil, how would that be perceived?
Well, I don't know if you remember, but Reagan called the Soviet Union evil, and there was a lot of people that criticized him for it. You remember Jimmy Carter was trying to, create this whole new reset with the Soviet Union, and Reagan came in and he called the Soviet Union what it was, which was an evil empire, and really started to focus on the economic and in particular for Reagan, the ideological aspects of the Cold War and how the ideology was so important to the way the Soviet Union was run. And I think the Chinese Communist Party is no different. So there are elements that we can see in the first Cold War where the system started to waver a little bit on how we should talk about the Soviet Union, but it was Reagan that really kind of snapped things back. I think if you go back to the very beginning, it was Kennan who wrote the Long Telegram. That was a clear statement of what the Soviet Union was, what the leadership believed, and how we should think about them. There has been no such thing with China, right? There was no China Long Telegram. There's, and if Kennan was highly respected. You name me one highly respected statesman or diplomat in the United States that's written something similar that is as close to reality of what the Chinese Communist Party as Kennan did for the Soviet Union. Instead, we have Kissinger, highly respected. And Kissinger is aligned with the Chinese Communist Party in ways that, you can just look at the way that they treat him, almost like a demigod when he goes over there and visits. And so we don't have, somebody that is respected across the aisle, respected in the national security establishment like Kennan was, that's willing to stand up and say, these guys are bad. This is what they care about. And, when we had, President Trump, who was willing to begin to, say we have a problem with China, in the end, he vacillated. He said, Xi Jinping is an okay guy and we get along good. I believe, it is very important that we call them what they are, and then we begin to treat them as if they are that, or else we're going to continue to succumb to these half measures that in China loves half measures because they can basically use that to continue to do anything they want, whether that be in trade or finance or ideology. They can, if you give them an inch, they'll take a mile. If you say, China is like, America, that people have choices. in some respect. And they'll say, yeah, China's, the party will say China is a democracy. These are the things that I think we have a very, very hard time in the West. Really, you have to call them what they are, and and that person, whoever that is, right now you can't find somebody that has credibility that is a China expert that is willing to go on record and say these guys are evil.